Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of New Books in Political Science. I'm your host, Joe Renoir. My guest today is Dr. Jussi Hanhimäki. We'll discuss his new book, which is titled Pax Transatlantica, America and Europe in the Post-Cold War Era, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. Dr. Jussi Hanhimäki is professor of international history and co-director of the History and Policy Initiative at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. He's the author of many books, including the award-winning The Flawed Architect, Henry Kissinger and American Foreign Policy, and The Rise and Fall of Détente, American Foreign Policy and the Transformation of the Cold War. Dr. Hanhimäki, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Before we get to your new book, tell us a bit about your background and your interests. It seems to me that you are something of a transatlantic figure yourself.
Yes, so I am originally from Finland, and I left Finland to pursue graduate studies in the United States in the late 1980s, just as the Cold War was coming to an end. So in some ways, in fact, the book is a sort of, it's not biographical as such, but it does cover the period in which I've been out of Finland more or less and traveling the Atlantic. I spent many years in the United States and also a couple of years in Canada. And then in 1995, I moved to London, to the London School of Economics, where I stayed for 5 years in the international history department there. And then in 2000, I arrived here in Geneva, where I've been a professor of international history and politics for the last 2 decades, for the entire millennium, if you will. And so that's the short of it. And there's been a few twists and turns in terms of spending a year in Washington, D.C., and some time in Oslo, Norway, and other places. But that's the main story. And so I like to think of myself as yes, sort of having lived a kind of a transatlantic life over my adult life, and at the same time being a sort of I'm a citizen of Finland, of course, but I've also about 5 years ago became a citizen of Switzerland, so I consider myself a sort of a super neutral when it comes down to discussing matters of international relations. So that's my my brief bio, if you will.
Okay, great. You have a very strong background, Jussi, in diplomatic history, but your new book, Pax Transatlantica, is concerned with the present, concerned with the future. Why write about this subject, and why do it now?
So there is, there is a strong historical element in the book as well, and of course, everything we write is in some ways is history, but I think overall it's sort of in some ways you mentioned the History and Politics Initiative earlier. It's my belief that history and current politics just cannot be divorced from each other. They are not two separate specimens, and so I think much of the commentary that we see in present day politics, the return of the term Cold War at such a vengeance over the last little while. These are that we often fighting those historical or referring to those historical analogies quite freely and quite easily, because it is the best way or the easiest way, not necessarily the best way, the easiest way that we can make sense of where we are and where we might be actually going in the future. And so I mean, as a principle, I don't believe that there is no great divide between what is history and what is politics. And I think that's the sort of one answer to your question. The other answer relates to the subject matter, which is that, like I said, I've been sort of following or living this kind of a transatlantic life, and as a consequence, following what's going on in transatlantic relations, mostly as an observer for the last sort of curious observer over the last 3 decades or so. And there's a couple of things that sort of have stood out from that period repeatedly. One is the sort of the constant sense among many commentators that there's a crisis in transatlantic relations, that there is some kind of a breach that is becoming some sort of terminal. That we've seen these types of headlines so many times over the past 3 decades. And yet, at the same time, of course, the transatlantic relationship seems to be doing, I would argue, and I argue in the book, quite well throughout this same period. So this curious thing about a relationship that's constantly in crisis and yet at the same time seems to be doing just fine. It's even thriving. It's if you start thinking about institutions like NATO. The most remarkable aspect of NATO over the last 30 years is not that it's in crisis and about to fold, but rather that it's grown so much and it's taken on a new kind of character, in fact, in the post Cold War era. So I was wanting to figure this out, and I think the trigger that really got me thinking about actually writing a book about was 2016. In a context in which you saw or we witnessed the sudden, apparently sudden rise of populism and the sort of commentary that went with it by people like Donald Trump, who are calling NATO obsolete and all the rest of it, and incidents or not incidents. Events like the Brexit vote, which seemed to also characterize something that was a terminal crisis, is slightly different than the transatlantic one, perhaps, but the terminal crisis in terms of Britain's relationship with Europe. So I was that's I think was the sort of the final trigger that I figured maybe it's time to think about this relationship in a sort of this conflictual yet thriving relationship and not in a sort of snapshot what's happening this week way, but take a slightly more long-term perspective, a longue durée perspective that we would say here in French-speaking Switzerland. So that's really those are the main reasons, and I think an additional reason for the book and what I talk about in the book was this other notion that has been quite prevalent over the past couple of decades, which is the idea that for the transatlantic relationship, the Cold War was the golden era. And that was the era when you saw true cooperation, because after all there was an existential threat that united the Western democracies together and in a fight against the Soviet Union and its allies. But I think that also, on some reflection, we can find that indeed the Cold War period witnessed plenty of crises in the transatlantic relationship. Too many to enumerate, whether it's about so-called out-of-area issues like Suez, whether it's the French decision under Charles de Gaulle to effectively withdraw from NATO's military cooperation, and so whether it's various trade-related issues and so forth. So I wanted to slightly also debunk this notion that there had been a golden era, and then post-1990, 1991, we've seen a decline in the transatlantic relationship with this, and so those are the main reasons I think that I set out to examine the transatlantic relationship over the past 3 decades.
Well, it's an interesting thing, Dr. Hanhimäki. You're entering into what is a very formidable and long-standing argument between those I would call the pessimists and the optimists. I don't think that's a very good terminology, but as you've expressed, you're firmly in the latter camp, and we might as well dive into this. There's a very straightforward and very strong thesis in this book, I'll just quote very quickly from the text. You write of your title, the Pax Transatlantica. Of course, we're all familiar with the Roman peace and the many uses of the Latinate term there. You say the term refers to, quote, the multiple ways in which the nations, institutions, people, and economies of the two sides of the Atlantic have become ever more closely connected in the decades following the end of the Cold War. This historic trend is likely to continue into the foreseeable future. So I think there are two parts to this question. One is the big question about explaining. You have a somewhat optimistic vision. I don't know if that's exactly the right term. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And the other is, why does there seem to be so much attention to the negative, to the crises, to disagreement? There seems to be a constant refrain of, well, the transatlantic relationship is troubled. It's falling apart. I mean, this is a bugbear for anyone trying to write something about the transatlantic relationship, because all of the naysaying terms have been used. You cannot really say it's in crisis, because it's always in crisis. Describe a bit your optimism and explain a bit, why is there so much attention to crisis?
Right. I mean, these are, I mean, like you said, these are the big questions. These are the sort of the central, really the central broad questions. And you're absolutely right to say that there's been there's a sort of dividing line that those that you see come up quite often with what you call pessimists, those who see the demise of the transatlantic relationship as imminent and inevitable, tend to have the bigger megaphone in that debate often, because I think the optimists tend to often be castigated as simply reciting some well-trotted party line, if I can put it that way, from coming from either NATO statements or some other such institutional context. The sort of common values, common this, common that seems to be, that really is not a headline catcher, right? So I think that is part of the second answer. But in terms of my optimism, if you want to call it that, it's not so much optimism in a sense that there would be that there is some kind of a utopia out there that we are going towards. I don't think that's not at all what I'm arguing here. My optimism is mainly this. The sort of thing that this, and based upon what I see as a long-term trajectory of transatlantic relations, that while there's not going to be a sort of total integration of the two sides of the Atlantic under one roof, under one tent, that would imply that their economies are totally integrated, that their security interests are totally similar, and that their politics follow totally similar paths. I don't think that is ever going to happen, but I would argue that actually is the strength of this, because what the transatlantic relationship really survives on is diversity of all kind, and that is why it has survived as long as it has, as a sort of fundamental building block or fundamental aspect of international relations in the late 20th and throughout the early part of the 21st century. So that's the kind of optimism I have. It's not, in other words, not that I see this as utopian in any way. I see it as in many ways a sort of what the real world at the moment looks like and is likely to look like going into the future. Because I don't think that, we can maybe come back to this later, but I don't think the trends that we see today are towards more disunity in terms of the transatlantic relationship. But rather, to a large extent, it seems to me that the opposite is probably true. Now, in terms of this, the second point of the second question, which is about this negative tendency of that we often see. And most famously, I guess, in the post-Cold War era, the very snappy sort of characterization of Americans from Mars and Europeans from Venus, right? Which gained some headlines in the early part of the 21st century. So Robert Kagan's um, book, which sort of argued that in fact there was that Europeans and Americans were basically from different planets. That was the basic point. But I think so that you could argue that is in some ways the more popular type of analysis that we've seen often whenever there's a small crisis or even a bigger crisis, whether it has to do with things like the post 9/11 scenarios and the Iraq War and so forth, that of course was caused a great deal of tension among a number of countries on the two sides of this line. I don't never dispute that. But as we've seen, then those crises have been smoothed over, and I think the easiest, simplest, most straightforward explanation to that is that Americans and Europeans, they need each other for various reasons, whether economic, whether in terms of security, and so forth, and where the political disagreements come from. And I think that's where I think I write in the book that, for many of these disagreements, actually democracy has something to answer for, because it does the freedom of expression that comes with it, the very sort of the lifeblood in some ways of Western democracies, allows for disagreements to be voiced in ways that often dominate the headlines and may give an appearance that indeed a terminal crisis is at stake. However, at least looking at the last 30 years and even going back to the Cold War period, it seems that all those so-called terminal crises somehow have been smoothed over. So that's where also. So I think that sort of the optimism, the tendency towards the negative, is in part ingrained in the transatlantic relationship. But one should look forward to many years of future crises and disagreements and so forth. And I don't think that is in any way a sign that the transatlantic relationship is about to blow up, so to speak.
Well, Dr. Hanemaki, I agree. I see that in what you've just said, and also in the book, you're certainly not laying out a utopian vision. I think I read that you were quite realistic, and I mean that in every sense of the term. And I think in a sense, perhaps you're also giving a bit of a boost to the ideals of a multi-party democracy. If democracy is, as is often said, it's a place for people to argue. It's a place for people to disagree, and maybe the disagreements make a democratic society stronger. You're implying, and also I think you really say this directly in a few points, the transatlantic relationship draws some long-term strength from disagreements. That how do we know what one of the other countries or the other countries in the relationship want? How do we know what they're thinking then from the disagreements? And you have a very great game you play with your students where you can describe this if you'd like, where you give them a quote or a citation and you ask them, who said this and when was it? And as you described, students tend to think, well, this must have been from very recently. And in fact, you can find any number of quotes from the last 50 or 60 years of people criticizing the relationship, saying that it's about to end and that kind of thing. Can you describe that anecdote very quickly?
Sure. Yeah, it's a game. I teach a course about the transatlantic relationship pretty much every other year here at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and so in the first class, I've started to giving them put a quote up and ask them to, I call it date citation game, and I give them a quote and no date, no name. So one of the quotes I use is from Raymond Vernon and it goes basically says that there's a profound shift taking place in the relationship between the United States and Western Europe, and following that, those who would think that the achievement of some kind of moderate world order depends on cooperation in the Atlantic area, so within the transatlantic context, the implication of the change are very, very disturbing. And so I put up this quote. Most recently get the sort of, it's either it's the Trump, some kind of a Trump era commentary in I tell them it's from Foreign Affairs, the journal Foreign Affairs, and it all must be in the Trump era. And then reflection to Trump calling the NATO alliance obsolete. So I smirk, and they realize it's not true. So then I always get Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus from 2003, but it's not that either. And then eventually I revealed the great secret, which is from 1973. And it's what was billed at one point the Year of Europe by Henry Kissinger. And a year that saw a lot of tension, in fact, rather than a sort of rebirth of the Atlantic Alliance, as Henry Kissinger had wanted. It became a very acrimonious debate across the Atlantic, exacerbated even more when the October War began in the Middle East, and the oil crisis hit particularly Western Europe, quite hard. So it created a different perception on how to address that particular issue. So the point I then make is simply that you can find these quotes, like you said, you can find quotes like this in almost any period. What I choose is a quote from 50 years ago. So it's not, and I think one could use most of those words and place them in 2016 and find 2017 and they would fit at least in broad terms. So that's the point. There is this the crisis mentality is not new. I think this is one of the points or starting points of in fact of the.
This episode is brought to you by Rad Power Bikes, designed to be a blast to ride and good for the environment. Rad Power Bikes have affordable e-bikes for every kind of rider. Get this year's must-have holiday gift at radpowerbikes.com.
Book.
Well, let's dive into the structure of the book. Your central argument is built around three pillars. One is the security relationship, one is the economic relationship, and one is the parallel political developments. Can we start off? You've already mentioned a bit about NATO, but it's worth giving you a bit more time to describe the argument. There's been so much Sturm und Drang these last few years, let's call it the last 5 years, over NATO, over, everything from Trump's criticism of NATO, President Macron's criticism of NATO. There's the questions about is NATO actually ineffectual? The West did very little to punish Russia for what happened in Crimea and for other actions. The expansion of the mission into Afghanistan and Libya, not necessarily resulting in what leaders wanted. So you're offering a little bit of a counterintuitive argument here. What's the argument about the strength and resilience of NATO, and how do you read that as actually an organization that's, as you put it, surprisingly successful?
So. Everything that you said, absolutely true in terms of NATO being, or the NATO's purpose being questioned quite a bit in the past 5-10 years, in fact, throughout the post-Cold War era. And I think that probably is the starting point, is that when the Cold War ended, that the first debate was whether one needed NATO anymore. Given that the existential threat, the other alliance was gone, Warsaw Pact was no more. So what's NATO for? And I think that was the big question for the 1990s in particular. I think the answer to that came in the form of NATO enlargement, the first set of NATO enlargements. And it was given not necessarily by the United States, but rather by Hungary, Poland, and Czech, what was still Czechoslovakia at the time, and then split to the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And it was that, well, it may be that the Soviet Union was gone, but certainly countries in East Central Europe on the road towards democratization and joining free market economies and joining, essentially becoming part of the transatlantic world. That these countries felt a very strong need to have some kind of guarantee, continuing guarantee into the 21st century, that their security, their external threats to them would not be, that they would have some kind of a security blanket over them under which they could more successfully then build a new democratic, market-oriented order. And so I think that was the first point. And I think in many ways that was successful. And I think what it set in place is a sort of series of enlargements that have led to the moment in 2020 when North Macedonia joined the NATO alliance, that NATO now has 30 countries compared to the 12 that originally in 1949 had formed NATO. And in fact, most, if not all, of that enlargement has taken place since 1990. So if you discount Spain, for example, and West Germany joining NATO during the Cold War, then much of that enlargement predominantly has taken place since the end of the Cold War. And that to me already is an indication that this must be a somewhat attractive proposition, that join the particular alliance, in this case NATO, is something that provides a sense of security to the newcomers. And I think we often think, however, about NATO enlargement slightly differently. We consider this as a provocation, right? And the narrative that we mostly hear is a narrative of NATO provoking, and even in some cases sort of justifying certain actions on the part of Russia, for example, Crimea, as that you already mentioned, but also before that, engagement in Georgia, engagements in the eastern parts of Ukraine, and so forth. So there is, and I wouldn't deny that there is a link there, but it seems to me that that narrative has perhaps gotten a bit too much play in recent years. Now, the other point about NATO's success is that not only did it grow, which already I think is significant, but it has also taken on a somewhat new kind of new character. I mean, if its main reason for living during the Cold War was the simple existence of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, it became clear in the 1990s that since that presumably had become a much less of a threat to the alliance as a whole, then as a security alliance, what were the threats that NATO countries should be concerned about? And I think that's where we've seen the sort of the adaptability, not always very successful one necessarily. And you mentioned, for example, Libya and Afghanistan being a very obvious case when certainly the success must be questioned and very, very seriously. But we've seen a sort of very different outlook on security. That security is not just NATO being there, which was the case in the Cold War. NATO's success was basically that it never had to do anything, but it deterred something from the worst case scenario from happening by simply being there. Now, in the post-Cold War era, we've seen, of course, NATO becoming somewhat more active outside of its area, and the question that often created crises in transatlantic relations during the Cold War, and to some extent even since, which was about out of area issues, so outside the NATO area. So we've seen these cases of NATO engagement where it's in Afghanistan, a little bit in Iraq, of course Libya, and so forth, and that is, while not great successes, all of them, it does tell us something about an alliance that is not frozen in time in terms of its raison d'être, its reason for living.
Well, I think you raise a very interesting point if I might just add on to what you've said. I think in the discussion about NATO expansion, you imply in the book that perhaps it's a bit too focused on Washington and Moscow. And I'm not weighing in right now. I'm not commenting on the perception among many in Russia that this was a provocation, the moving NATO to the east. But you make a very good point that these were democratic governments that decided democratically to join NATO. They said, we want to do this, that in fact, maybe we should reorient our perspective on NATO expansion away from Washington and Moscow and think in terms of what it is that these countries of Central and Eastern Europe wanted, their unique histories, their unique security perceptions. Is that accurate? Am I reading you correctly?
I think that's quite accurate. I think it also, it's the other point of all this which relates to the European, and you mentioned Macron and so forth. So the strategic autonomy that European strategic autonomy discussion, which has been quite prevalent actually in the last couple of years, and which has highlighted, 2 points. Number one, which is that there is a need or a desire and so forth among many Europeans for increased autonomy from the United States in the security arena. But paradoxically, this discussion has also highlighted the indispensable nature that many other Europeans consider that the United States still has, and the important role the United States still has to play in the context of European security. So yes, but you're absolutely right that in the end, I think the discussion that we've seen, whether it's in Moscow, whether it's in the United States as well, often focuses on those two actors rather than the other, the 28 European countries that also are member states of NATO, and particularly the ones that have joined since the end of the Cold War, because those are the ones that did so for a number of reasons that had nothing to do with the original rationale, or had very little to do with ultimately about the original rationale of NATO in 1949.
So can we switch gears a little bit and talk about the second pillar, economic ties? This is another area that has been the source of much public disagreement in the last 5 years. One can look, for example, at the TTIP agreement being put on the back burner. In fall of 2019, we saw that Trump's trade war interest was not just about China, but that he was willing to place tariffs on agricultural goods and aircraft coming out of Europe, that there was this feeling that maybe the Europeans cannot rely on America, not just for security, but also a continuity of the economic relationship. But you suggest, and I think you make a very good argument for the tremendous amount of integration in the transatlantic economic space. Can you talk a bit about that?
Right. So in terms of the integration, so let me just, before I talk about some maybe for other few figures, but in terms of the overall argument, I think what and you mentioned TTIP and so forth. I think from the 1990s onwards, there's been this ongoing discussion, on and off discussions, I have to say, about the Big Bang that would really integrate the transatlantic economy, that the sort of create a true free trade area and so forth. And as we've seen, they almost inevitably have stalled on various forms of disagreements, whether it has to do with something to do with subsidies or agricultural products, whether it's any number of issues that have caused concern. The labor movements on both sides of the Atlantic being concerned about the implications of things like that. And I think one thing I'm fairly confident about is that you are quite unlikely to see that kind of equivalent to the creation of the European Economic Community in the 1950s. You're unlikely to see that kind of a sort of deep integration in terms of trade and a creation of a true free trade area anytime soon in the transatlantic context. But my argument is basic argument in terms of saying that that doesn't mean there hasn't been deeper integration in the transatlantic economy since the end of the Cold War, because if we start looking at some of the figures on this, we start with always discuss trade, of course, and where we see trade in goods. The United States and Europe, they are each other's main export markets when it comes to goods, even today. Each of them, and that's sort of is a side point to all of this, is also their main external source of imports of industrial goods is of course the People's Republic of China. And so they're in that sense, in a global sense, they are very much in the same position in terms of being major importers of Chinese goods. But my argument would be that the sort of, while we traditionally have often and still to some extent do focus on trade in goods, we should perhaps look at some of the other figures that often don't make headlines so easily. And two of those maybe to mention. One, which is trade in services, and in that era and in that arena, the United States or North America, broadly speaking, and Western Europe, not just the European Union, but including Great Britain, Switzerland, and so forth. Clearly, there is a deeply integrated and heavily successful sort of marketplace when it comes down to the production of services, and in that arena, China is a very small player when it comes down to providing services. And then I think one of the maybe the most significant part of the argument ultimately is a question of investment, and that's where we've seen over the last 30 years, and going back to the 70s, even to the Cold War era, we've seen that North America and Europe being each other's favorite FDI, foreign direct investment destinations. That together they amount to something, I don't know, with somewhere around 65% perhaps of global FDI, and most of that figure is actually transatlantic investment, which to me sort of indicates a different kind of deep integration, in that it means often creating jobs, investing in subsidiaries of American and or European companies on the other side of the Atlantic, and all of this is happening, I would assume, because there is an expectation on the part of the investor that these are safe investments, that the political systems, the political stability, and underscored perhaps by the relative sort of security of in terms of the areas provided by the North Atlantic Alliance, means that investors are not so concerned about the negative outcome of or negative consequences of investing heavily across the Atlantic. So that's the sort of the integration part. And maybe just to add to that there's of course there's a negative part to this integration, that it means that often in terms, if you look at the past 30 years, when that American and European economies tend to rise and fall together, basically. That we saw this perhaps most evidently and most obviously in the context of the so-called Great Recession, starting in 2007, when once the American subprime market started to tank and it had started to sort of have an impact on the overall economy, the Europeans very quickly followed suit. And that had then, the economics downturn, both on both sides of the Atlantic, added in Europe to other things like the Euro crisis and so forth. And then the sort of slight return from that, and you don't see that quite similar sort of patterns if you were to look at the Chinese economy or in many other parts of the world that are perhaps less connected to the transatlantic economy. So those are the sort of, so again here I'm not arguing that there is some kind of full convergence that the United States is purely a European economic power and doesn't have any economic interest elsewhere, for example, or the Brits or the European Union and so forth. But that within that it's fairly clear when looking at many of the statistics that economically the connections, the transatlantic marketplace is not only the wealthiest marketplace in the world, it is in many ways the most deeply integrated marketplace in the world.
So let's, in the time we have left, can you cover a bit about the third tier, which is the description of the, I think maybe often hidden integration of, integration, I guess not the right word, but parallel developments in domestic politics in North America and in Europe. Populism is a buzzword in the last 5 years or so, 5 or 6 years since Brexit in 2015 and since Trump's election in 2016. Like the other two subjects, it's something about which there has been a great deal of hand-wringing and people spelling out the end of democracy or the end of the transatlantic relationship. You pose a very interesting argument here as well, saying that there is a roughly similar chronology and parallel developments in both the U.S. and Europe. Can you talk a bit about that, and how do you see this setting up, and where does it bring us today?
Right. So I'll come to populism in a second, but I think maybe the starting point of this discussion, number one, it's not to say that that American and European politics, like you said, they're not integrated in a sense that we'd be running the same elections and this and that and the other thing. They are parallel in a sense that it is possible, and I could say this is in some ways quite obvious that this is taking place. There are parallel developments taking place on both sides of the Atlantic, with populism being one of the, and then not only populism, but then what I would call the pushback against populism, the most recent trend that I would argue is in evidence in the last couple of years. That you've seen parallel developments over the past 3 decades in a way that perhaps you didn't see quite those kinds of parallel developments in the Cold War context. And this is where I sort of, in this part would draw a distinction between the Cold War politics, transatlantic politics, versus what comes after 1990. And the dividing line is in large part perhaps in Europe, because what happens in Europe when the Cold War ends is that there's suddenly the old left, or the extreme left in Europe, which was in many countries a sort of active participant in West European politics, whether in France or Italy, Finland, my own country. There were significant Communist Party presence in, and they got a significant chunk of the popular vote. And since these were multi-party rather than sort of bi-party systems as in the United States and the UK, they often were represented, if not in government, then in many other. They represented a strong sort of opposition party and in a number of political systems across Western Europe. What happened after 1990 is that these communist parties basically disappeared, and the sort of the idea, I guess, captured in this notion about the end of history, which doesn't quite satisfy many. But the idea that suddenly we were entering some kind of a post-ideological age after the end of the Cold War. I think that sort of took a hold in Europe, and I would argue also in the United States, where perhaps the transformation is not quite as obvious or as remarkable as in many European countries. But you do see the notions about these ideas that you could divide the political spectrum to left and right in very simple terms. So that was being challenged. And I would argue, and what I argue in this part of the book, basically, is in the 1990s, what we see emerge from that is what we sometimes call third way politics, politics of the middle. That we see leaders who are no longer sort of ideologically wedded to the left or the right in that old sense, like Bill Clinton in the United States, like Tony Blair in the UK, like Gerhard Schröder in Germany, and Romano Prodi perhaps in Italy, and so forth. And you get this third way, this the New Democrats or the New Labour, all of these new type of discourse that enters, in which you basically are starting to fight over the votes for votes in the great middle of politics. And I think that is the case in both in the United States and across Europe throughout I would say the first decade and a half after the end of the Cold War. And then we have this break, which I already referred to, the Great Recession, which clearly shakes up some of this this sort of drive to the center and creates a space for what we call populism, which is a hopelessly imprecise term for many things in politics. But basically what we see in the 2010s is the emergence of populism as a major political force across Europe, and also in North America, and particularly, of course, in the United States. You see it first in the form of the Tea Party, for example, but then later on, yes, we see Donald Trump, but of course we also see Bernie Sanders, and then there are, populism is not just of the populism of the right, although that's what we have tended to focus on in all analysis. You see this rise of populist movements and parties. They take different shape and form in different countries, often depending on the type of political system that is in place. So in a country like the United States, which is basically a two-party system, Democrats and Republicans, you see, of course, populism take over within the parties, within the established parties. And in the Republican Party, of course, where the ultimate sort of climax of all of this is Donald Trump and his election in 2016. But you do see others, in most European countries, you see similar kinds of movements and parties. Think about the Liga in Italy. They often sort of very play upon nationalist sentiments, but in this context of economic uncertainty, blamed on globalization, migration, which is a common theme, anti-migration policy for parties like the Liga. It's a big theme in the context of the British Brexit debate. It's a big theme for the so-called true Finns in Finland, for the Front National in France, and so forth. So similar themes across the board are clearly emerging as the driving forces, as the vote getters, if you will, for these political movements or parties that are created, or also sort of the sub-party context, like you could argue that the Trump supporters within the Republican Party, or Boris Johnson supporters within the Conservative Party in Britain, and so forth. So the point really is not that everything is the same, but it is that in terms of a broad analysis, one can say that there are parallel developments that are taking place in North America, across Europe, and of course, I'm not disputing the fact that Hungary looks very different from Italy, which looks very different from Britain, and that looks very different from France. So there's no question about that. There are still specific characteristics, but on the broad outlines, you can see that if anything, the 1990s were sort of the decade of the center left. In some ways, the early 2000s perhaps the gravitating a little bit to the center right, and then the 2010s we saw the rise of populism, and now I think we are in a moment in which there's a kind of a pushback against populism. Maybe a last point just to add to that one additional thing, what I find interesting and in this is how important what takes place in the political world in the United States is actually still on the other side of the Atlantic. That Trump's election was not just an American event; it triggered a lot of sort of. Many of the populist leaders saw it in some way as their win as well, and there's no accident that Matteo Salvini, for example, who was the leader of the Italian Lega, the sort of the right-wing populist party in Italy, in 2020 he was wearing in public a MAGA hat, so Make America Great Again. Now, why would an Italian political leader be wearing that? That sort of shows the transnational element in an appeal, and also the influence that the United States and American elections, the biggest sort of democratic game in town, still has on the other side of the Atlantic.
Well, you see, this has been a delightful conversation about your book. I would love to talk about it for another hour, but I know that time is short. Is there anything we've left out? Is there anything you'd like to add about your argument and your marshaling of resources here? Anything that we have not had time to get to?
So I think maybe one thing I could simply add that what the book ultimately is, it is not a book about. It's not a book about how the transatlantic relationship functions internally, rather than a book about how it fits into the broader context of the modern world. So I don't talk that much about a new Cold War scenario with China or Russia. However, what I would perhaps it might be in closing interesting to that. To me, many of these, what we've seen in the last couple of years, and certainly this year in 2021 alone, these concerns about the incoming U.S. administration, about China and so forth, efforts to get Western Europe to sort of sign up and NATO become some kind of an alliance that not only is concerned about, of course, Russia, but also about China. I think it sort of highlights or in many ways supports the overall argument that I tried to make, which is that the transatlantic relationship is actually on a rather strong footing, because all those debates show how important Europe is for the United States still in 2021, which is one of those questions that has been asked over and over again. And I don't think there's any doubt about the situation the other way around. I think the United States still carries an awful lot of weight in Europe, whether it's as a sort of political trendsetter, as I was just talking about populism and so forth, or whether because of the or economic significance and, of course, the security connection that is so deeply embedded in the context of NATO.
Well, Dr. Jussi Hanhimäki, this has been great. The title of the book is Pax Transatlantica, America and Europe in the Post-Cold War Era. I think it's an excellent, concise read. And as Dr. Hanhimäki has explained, it's gives us much to think about. It's focused enough, but it gives us food for thought on the broader security and economic questions that we're going to be facing in the future as well. Dr. Hanhimäki, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's been really a great pleasure talking with you this afternoon.